So imagine you're at the pump, right? And you're paying like €3 for a liter of diesel.
Which is just brutal.
It is. It's brutal. And you're told, every single time you turn on the news that the world is just running out of fuel.
Right. The classic supply chain narrative.
Exactly. You feel the pinch, you see grocery prices just skyrocketing, and you accept it because, well, I mean, the official map says there's a global shortage.
Yeah.
But what if at that exact same moment, there's a maritime skipper named Hank sitting in a European harbor for 3 weeks, staring at like 15 massive cargo ships that are literally banned from unloading their completely full tanks?
It kind of shatters that whole reality you thought you were living in, you know?
Sure.
You realize the map you've been navigating by, it wasn't drawn to help you find your way. It was drawn to justify the toll booth you just drove through.
Okay, let's unpack this, because today we are really stripping away that map. Welcome to the deep dive, by the way. Our mission today is to cut through the noise and get to what's really going on behind these headlines you're seeing.
Right.
We are diving into this remarkably dense, just a multi-layered broadcast from a Dutch program called Lighthouse TV. And what makes this specific source so incredibly vital is that it isn't just like politicians talking at you.
No, not at all.
It's a collection of ground-level testimonies, real people who actually operate the machinery of our world. We have a maritime skipper handling global commodities.
Yeah.
We have a military veteran tracking geopolitical troop movements.
Yeah.
We've got a financial entrepreneur dissecting wealth taxation, and an immunologist analyzing sworn testimony from a parliamentary inquiry.
And, at first glance, those feel like 4 entirely separate documentaries.
Yeah, completely unrelated. Fuel, war, taxes, biology.
Exactly. But when you synthesize these testimonies, a singular, just massive pattern emerges. It's the mechanics of deception.
Well,
it really is.
yeah.
It is this widening chasm between the official narratives we're spoon-fed, the justifications for why things are expensive or dangerous or mandatory, and the actual operational ground-level reality functioning behind the curtain.
Right. So whether it's the fuel in your car or the money in your savings account or the medicine in your bloodstream, the overarching question for you today is are we dealing with natural scarcity and necessary rules? Or are we looking at a hidden machinery that deliberately manipulates the system while we're all just distracted by the headlines?
And in this era of absolute information overload, understanding how that machinery works isn't just some intellectual exercise.
No, it's survival.
Right. It's a prerequisite for navigating the modern economy. You really have to look at the mechanics, the incentives, and crucially, who is profiting from the bottleneck.
So let's jump straight into the deep end with the most tangible example possible: the price of fuel.
Yeah, let's do it.
Because it affects every single listener. It determines your commute, your heating, the cost of food on your table. And the official story, the one in every major paper, is that geopolitical tensions, specifically involving Iran and the Middle East, have constricted the global supply chain.
Ergo, fuel is scarce.
Ergo, you pay almost €3 a liter in Europe.
That is the narrative, yeah. It's clean, it's logical, and it puts the blame on this uncontrollable distant force. But the Lighthouse TV broadcast brings on Henk Boonstra.
The skipper.
Right. Henk is a maritime skipper. He physically moves this product on the water, and his lived experience completely contradicts this whole narrative of scarcity.
So put us on the boat with Hank. What exactly is his reality?
Well, Henk recounts this specific, highly illuminating voyage. He loads his vessel with a product called FAME.
FAME.
Yeah, it stands for fatty acid methyl ester,
Okay.
which is a key component of biodiesel.
Yeah.
So he loads thousands of tons of this supposedly precious, scarce commodity in Vlaardingen, which is an industrial port city in the Netherlands. The paperwork dictates a completely standard, routine run over to Amsterdam to offload.
Which should take, what, like a matter of hours? Maybe a day, depending on harbor traffic?
Exactly. It's a localized, straightforward logistical movement.
Yeah.
So he arrives in Amsterdam, and then he is told to drop anchor.
Just wait.
Just sit there for 10 days.
10 days.
10 full days of a massive commercial vessel, fully crewed, engines running on standby, doing absolutely nothing. The receiver just won't take the fuel.
10 days of burning operational costs for a product the market supposedly desperately needs right now?
Yeah, and then the orders suddenly shift. They don't unload in Amsterdam. He's redirected south to Ghent in Belgium.
Okay.
So he sails to Ghent, arrives at the designated terminal, and, well, the exact same thing happens.
They're kidding.
He sits in the harbor for nearly 2 weeks. The receiver at the port tells him flat out, Like the client who actually owns the fuel simply does not want it offloaded yet.
So wait, I am standing at a gas station, looking at a digital sign telling me diesel is approaching €3 because there isn't enough of it to go around, while Hank is basically operating a floating parking lot, explicitly forbidden from delivering the fuel.
Yes, exactly. And Hank makes it painstakingly clear that his ship is not some isolated clerical error.
Hmm.
As he looks out across the water, right there in his immediate vicinity, he counts at least 15 other massive cargo ships doing the exact same thing.
15 ships.
Just bobbing in the water, loaded to the brim, ordered to wait.
That is a staggering volume of liquid energy just taken completely off the board.
But the bottleneck isn't just on the water. Hank details the state of the land-based infrastructure, too.
Yeah.
He points to the Europort in Rotterdam, one of the most critical energy hubs on the planet.
Yeah.
And he points to the Sea Invest terminals in Antwerp, where they have essentially converted vast swaths of the port into a colossal tank park. And according to this maritime insider, those storage tanks are completely full.
Really?
They are at absolute capacity.
See, here's where it gets really interesting to me. Because if the fuel physically exists and it's sitting right there in the harbor, why on earth would you hold it back?
Right.
When I try to understand this, my mind immediately goes to, artificial scarcity in consumer goods. Think about the De Beers diamond cartel in the 20th century.
Oh, perfect example.
They had vaults bursting with diamonds, but they only released a tiny trickle into the market to convince people that diamonds were incredibly rare, keeping the price astronomical.
Yeah.
Or even modern sneaker culture, You have these massive syndicates using bots to buy up 50,000 pairs of a new shoe release. They pack them into a warehouse in Nevada, and then they just drip feed them onto online marketplaces, artificially inflating the price by 300%. Is that what we're looking at here? Just scaled up to the most critical commodity on Earth?
That analogy is flawless because the exact same mathematical mechanism is at play. In the global energy market, the entities orchestrating this are the massive commodity trading houses. The broadcast specifically names giants like Trafigura and Vitol. Now, these aren't the companies pulling the oil out of the ground, and they are the gas stations selling it to you.
They're the middlemen.
They are the invisible middlemen who control the flow.
So Trafigura is the quote-unquote client that told Hank to just sit in the water in Ghent.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Hank's charterer might run the boat, but Trafigura owns the liquid inside it. They dictate when it enters the market.
But explain the logistics of that math to me. Keeping a massive cargo ship idling in a harbor for a month is not free. You have to pay the crew, you have port fees, you have to pay the ship owner, what I assume are massive penalties for holding up their vessel.
Yeah, absolutely.
Doesn't that eat into Trafigura's profits?
So you're talking about demurrage fees. Yes, the trading house has to pay the ship owner a daily penalty for tying up the vessel. It could be, tens of thousands of dollars a day.
Right.
But you have to look at the macroeconomic trend they are exploiting. We are in a market where the price of fuel is steadily rising, a rise heavily subsidized by the pervasive media narrative of geopolitical scarcity.
So they are betting on the narrative.
They're leveraging it. Think about it. If you have 10 million euros worth of biodiesel sitting on Hank's ship, and you know that because of market panic, that fuel will be worth 12 million euros next week, the math becomes very simple.
Oh, wow.
Even if you pay Hank 100,000 euros in demurrage fees to just park his boat, you are still netting an extra 1.9 million euros purely by starving the market for a few extra days.
Just by doing nothing.
Just by waiting. To deliberately choke the supply, which fulfills the prophecy of the shortage, which forces the price even higher. You manufacture the scarcity to maximize your margin.
Wow. Okay, but I have to push back here.
Sure.
This isn't happening in some lawless international water. This is happening in Rotterdam. This is happening in Antwerp. The Dutch and Belgian governments run these ports. They have the manifest, they have the satellite data, they know the tanks are full and the ships are idling.
Yes, they do.
So if the government's mandate is to protect its citizens and maintain a functioning economy, why do they allow this? Why do politicians go on television and blame supply chain issues in the Middle East when they know the fuel is sitting right off their own coastline? Is it just complete bureaucratic incompetence?
Well, it is rarely just incompetence when there are billions of dollars at stake.
Fair point.
The Lighthouse broadcast raises a deeply cynical but financially and mathematically accurate point about the state's role in this dynamic. You have to ask, who are the beneficiaries of a €3 liter of diesel?
Well, Trafigura, obviously.
Yes.
Yeah.
But the other massive shareholder in high fuel prices is the government itself.
How so? Because of taxes.
Exactly. The mechanism of excise taxes and value-added tax, or VAT. In Europe, and heavily emphasized in the Netherlands in this source, the tax burden on fuel is staggering. Between 50 and 75% of the final price you pay at the pump is tax.
Wait, up to 75%?
Yeah. But crucially, much of that tax scales with the base price of the commodity.
Really? So it's not just a flat rate per liter?
While there are fixed excise components, the VAT is a percentage of the total. So when the base price of the diesel skyrockets because a trading house is playing games in the harbor, the total taxable amount increases. The government's revenue scales up proportionally.
Ah. So the state isn't the victim here.
No. The state is experiencing record-breaking revenue windfalls. The government is quietly making an absolute killing off the artificially inflated prices. So there is zero financial incentive for the authorities to step up to a podium and say, actually, citizens, there's plenty of fuel. The traders are just hoarding it.
Because doing that would crash the price?
Right. It would crash the price and immediately slash the state's tax revenue.
So they just point to a conflict on the other side of the globe, shrug their shoulders in feigned helplessness, and rake in billions while the middle class takes the hit.
It is a perfect symbiotic relationship between corporate market manipulation and state tax extraction, validated by an official narrative that neither party wants to correct.
And what does that hit actually look like? Because it's not just about, a family having to skip a vacation because the road trip costs too much. The broadcast uses a really specific, brutal phrase, a transport infarct.
Yes. Infarct. In medical terms, an infarction is tissue death caused by lack of blood supply.
Like a heart attack.
Exactly. A transport infarct is when the economy's blood-supplied diesel fuel becomes so expensive that the circulatory system of the supply chain literally begins to shut down.
It's a cascading failure.
The broadcast highlights two incredibly stark ground-level examples. First, look at the Urk fishermen. Urk is a historic, culturally significant fishing municipality in the Netherlands. For generations, they have pulled food out of the North Sea. But right now, they are tying their boats to the docks and refusing to sail.
Because there aren't any fish.
Because of the math of the infarct. The diesel required to power a commercial trawler out into the deep sea, run the nets, and bring the catch back now costs more than the wholesale value of the fish they will bring in.
Oh my God.
Every time they turn the key in the ignition, they are losing money. So the boats stay parked. The food literally stops coming out of the ocean.
And on land, it's the exact same paralysis.
Exactly. The broadcast points to Slovenia, where independent truckers are simply stopping. If you own a small logistics company, you operate on razor-thin margins. When diesel doubles in price, you cannot afford to fill the tanks of a fleet of semi-trucks. You park your rigs.
And when the rigs park?
The raw materials don't make it to the factories, and the groceries don't make it to the supermarket shelves.
And the transport companies that do survive the infarct, the massive corporate logistics fleets, they have no choice but to pass that exorbitant fuel cost directly down the chain.
Precisely. So every single listener needs to understand this. When you walk into your local grocery store and your jaw drops because a carton of eggs, a bag of flour, or a tomato suddenly costs 30 or 40% more than it did a year ago, you are not paying for inflation.
No.
You are paying for Henk Boonstra's ship sitting idle in Ghent. You are paying the premium manufactured by the illusion of scarcity.
You're paying a phantom tax orchestrated by traders and collected by the state. And, it makes you realize that if corporate traders can orchestrate a phantom shortage in an Antwerp harbor just by holding back 15 ships, the tactics must be infinitely more ruthless when you scale up to the nations that actually pull the oil out of the ground.
Oh, absolutely.
Which brings us to a tiny piece of real estate that completely dictates global energy security.
Right. We are pivoting to the second massive theme of this broadcast, the geopolitical theater. And to unpack this, Lighthouse TV brings in Nico Norte, a veteran and geopolitical analyst, to examine the real-world military maneuvers happening in the Middle East, far beneath the surface of the mainstream news cycle.
Nico focuses heavily on a place called Kharg Island. Now, I consider myself fairly well read, but before diving into the source material, Kharg Island wasn't on my radar at all. Yet, when you look at the raw data, this tiny speck of land is holding up the sky.
Geographically, it is a small island located in the northern part of the Persian Gulf, just off the coast of Iran. But economically, it is the absolute epicenter of the Iranian state. The broadcast emphasizes a staggering statistic. 90% of Iran's entire oil export volume is pumped out of this single tiny island.
90%?
Yeah.
That is an almost incomprehensible vulnerability. I mean, if I'm a military strategist looking at an adversary and 90% of their revenue comes from a spot I can circle with the Sharpie on a map, that's the bullseye, right?
It operates as a colossal, vulnerable conveyor belt. Massive supertankers pull up to the deepwater docks, load millions of barrels, and sail out through the Strait of Hormuz. And what is fascinating is the historical continuity of this specific choke point.
Right.
The broadcast notes that centuries ago, in the 18th century, this exact island was operated by the Dutch East India Company, the VOC.
Wait, Kharg Island was Dutch?
Yes, they established a trading post and military fort there called Fort Mosselstein. Even 300 years ago, naval powers recognized that whoever controlled that specific rock controlled the flow of wealth out of the region. Today, the stakes are just exponentially higher because of who is buying the product.
And who is buying it? Because that dictates the entire rules of engagement for the current conflict.
The vast, overwhelming majority of the oil flowing out of Kharg Island feeds the Asian economic engine. The broadcast points out that China relies heavily on this specific pipeline to fuel its manufacturing base, and Japan is even more exposed. The source suggests Japan's reliance on this specific flow of energy could be up to 90% of its total import needs.
Okay, so let's apply this to the current headlines.
Yeah.
We are watching open, escalating hostilities between the United States, Israel, and Iran. We see missile exchanges. We see drone strikes on military bases. We see air defense systems being targeted.
Right.
But there is a glaring, massive omission in the target list. They have explicitly, carefully avoided dropping a single bomb on the oil terminals of Kharg Island.
Yeah.
If it's 90% of Iran's economy, why is the bullseye untouched?
This is what military strategists call the scorched earth dilemma. It is a terrifying balancing act. If the U.S. or Israel decides to crater Kharg Island, yes, they instantly turn the Iranian economy to ash overnight. But the kinetic shockwave doesn't stop at the border. You instantly crater the global energy market.
Just like the ships in Antwerp.
Exactly. Remember Trafigura holding back a few ships to raise the price? Imagine the market panic if millions of barrels of daily supply literally went up in smoke.
We wouldn't be looking at €3 a liter. We'd be looking at 10. It would be a global transport infarct on day one.
But the economic fallout is secondary to the geopolitical nightmare. If you bomb Kharg Island, you are directly destroying the primary energy source for the Chinese and Japanese economies. The conflict instantly, uncontrollably scales from a localized Middle Eastern turf war into a direct, existential confrontation with a global superpower.
Because China would have to react.
Bombing Kharg Island forces China's hand. The stakes are simply too high for a traditional bombing run.
So bombing it is off the table. It's a stalemate. But Nico Norte doesn't think it's a stalemate. He points to highly specific, largely unreported military movements that suggest a completely different playbook is being opened.
Yeah, Nico's analysis is rooted in reading the logistics, not the press releases. He tracks anomalous, highly specialized troop movements. He points out that the U.S. 82nd Airborne Division abruptly halted their scheduled training exercises.
Okay.
Simultaneously, the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit, carrying roughly 2,400 elite Marines aboard the USS Tripoli, was suddenly tracked moving from Okinawa, Japan, toward the Persian Gulf. He also tracks movements of the 10th Mountain Division.
Okay, I want to pressure test this. If I'm playing devil's advocate, maybe they are just moving troops to fortify bases in Iraq or Syria. What makes these specific units, airborne, Marines, mountain divisions, suspicious to Nico? What is the play if you aren't going to bomb the island?
Nico hypothesizes a surgical, incredibly high-risk kinetic operation. Instead of destroying the asset, you seize the asset. He theorizes the preparation for a highly specialized infiltration, potentially initiated by a halo jump.
Halo, high altitude, low opening. That sounds like something out of a Mission Impossible movie. Explain the mechanics of that, because it sounds insane to do over a heavily fortified island.
It is the absolute pinnacle of Tier 1 special operations. Instead of flying helicopters in low, where they can be shot down by radar-guided anti-aircraft batteries, transport planes fly at commercial airliner altitudes, 30 to 40,000 feet. Special Forces operators jump wearing oxygen masks and thermal suits.
Wow.
They free fall for miles, essentially invisible to standard ground radar due to their small cross-section and lack of a heat signature from an engine. They only deploy their parachutes the very last possible second, a few thousand feet above the target.
So they literally drop silently out of the stratosphere.
Exactly. They secure the critical infrastructure, the pumping stations, the control rooms, the deep water docks, before the defenders even know they are under attack. Once the perimeter is secure, That is when the 82nd Airborne drops in en masse to hold the territory, supported by the Marines arriving from the sea.
So the strategy isn't to destroy Iran's economy, it's to hold it hostage.
Precisely. If the United States captures Kharg Island intact, they instantly gain total, unmitigated leverage over the Iranian regime without triggering a global oil crisis, because the oil can theoretically continue to flow to Asia just under American administration.
It fundamentally rewrites the geopolitical balance of power overnight.
Exactly. Avoiding the scorched earth scenario while achieving total dominance.
That is a staggering logistical and strategic theory. It's brilliant, but it's incredibly risky. And Nico makes a fascinating point about why this kind of daring, boots-on-the-ground infantry operation is becoming both more necessary and infinitely more difficult. He talks about how the fundamental nature of warfare has mutated just in the last 36 months.
Yes, Nico draws heavily on the brutal realities we are seeing unfold in the conflict in Ukraine. For 70 years, military doctrine has been built around the main battle tank. We have this entrenched cinematic image of warfare, right? Massive columns of armored steel rolling across the plains, dominating the terrain.
Right, if you have the biggest tanks, you win the ground.
Well, that doctrine is dead. Nico points out that today, a multi-million-dollar, heavily armored main battle tank deployed to a modern front line has a functional life expectancy of roughly 2 minutes.
2 minutes? That's not a weapon, that's a steel coffin.
Yeah.
Why?
Because the airspace above the battlefield is now completely saturated with cheap, mass-produced, highly lethal drone technology. A $1,000 commercial drone, strapped with an anti-tank grenade and piloted through virtual reality goggles, can drop a payload directly onto the thinnest part of a tank's top armor. The tank is obsolete. The tactical dynamic is completely inverted.
So if the tank isn't the apex predator anymore, what is? Who are the targets?
The targets are the people flying the drones. Nico uses a chilling piece of military slang that has emerged. He calls these drum pilots the 20-minuters.
The 20-minuters. Explain the mechanics of that, because that sounds terrifying.
In the modern theater of war, the deadliest weapon isn't the explosive. It's the radio frequency signal. The moment a drone operator powers up their terminal, connects to the Starlink satellite and links to their drone, they are emitting a massive, glowing electronic signature in the electromagnetic spectrum.
Like shining a massive flashlight in a pitch-black room.
Exactly. And the adversary's electronic warfare units are constantly scanning for that light. The moment the signal broadcasts, the enemy triangulates the operator's exact GPS coordinates. From the second that pilot turns on their screen, they have approximately 20 minutes to launch their drone, fly the mission, drop the ordnance, pack up their gear, and literally sprint for their lives before a barrage of counter-battery artillery or a retaliatory missile completely obliterates the grid square they were just standing in.
Wow. So war is no longer about holding a trench or taking a hill. It is an invisible, high-speed, utterly lethal game of electronic cat and mouse.
It is a hyper-lethal environment where invisibility is your only armor. And speaking of invisible warfare and things moving in the shadows, Nico brings up a highly anomalous event regarding a location called Diego Garcia.
Diego Garcia. Again, a place most people couldn't point to on a map, but it holds immense strategic weight. It's an atoll in the middle of the Indian Ocean, basically a joint U.S. and U.K. military staging ground. It's incredibly remote.
It is thousands of miles from the Middle East.
Yeah.
And that distance is the crux of the anomaly. According to the established intelligence narrative, the official map, Iran's ballistic missile program was bounded by strict technological and political limits. The West operated under the firm assumption that Iran only possessed delivery systems with a maximum range of roughly 2,000 kilometers.
Enough to hit Israel, enough to hit U.S. bases in Iraq, but geographically contained to the region.
Correct. But the broadcast dissects an incident where an alleged missile stroke, or at least an attempted launch, originated from Iran, with the telemetry data pointing squarely at Diego Garcia as the target.
But wait, Diego Garcia is 4,000 kilometers away from Iran.
Exactly. If Iran fired a ballistic missile at Diego Garcia, it means the entire Western intelligence apparatus was wrong. It means Iran secretly developed, tested, and deployed a delivery system with double the known range. And Nico points out the terrifying strategic math. If you have a missile that can fly 4,000 kilometers south over the Indian Ocean to hit an island, you have a missile that can fly 4,000 kilometers west.
Direct to London. Direct to Paris.
It completely shatters the security umbrella of Western Europe.
Okay, but this is where I really need to challenge Nico's analysis because it feels a little too perfect. Are we really supposed to believe that Iran just accidentally tipped their hand and revealed a secret superweapon by shooting it at an empty stretch of ocean near a base? Nico himself seems incredibly skeptical of this official explanation in the source material.
And this is where we need to weave in a critical layer of analytical impartiality. It's important to look at Nico's theory here, not as confirmed reality, but as a deeply skeptical lens, which is what the broadcast is doing.
Right.
He is a veteran analyst looking at the exact same intelligence reports the Pentagon press room is looking at. But he is applying a profound distrust of institutional narratives. Nico points to the highly suspicious timing of this alleged launch.
Right, the timing is everything. What else was happening on that specific day?
This alleged launch occurred mere hours before high-level UK government ministers were scheduled to sit down in London for emergency briefings to decide their military posture and potential escalation in the Strait of Hormuz.
Oh, come on. So literally right when the UK is debating whether to commit forces and escalate the conflict, a magical piece of radar data appears proving that Iran could theoretically drop a warhead on Big Ben.
Nico raises the deeply uncomfortable prospect of a false flag, or a heavily manipulated intelligence event. He poses the question, was this actually an Iranian provocation? Or was this electronic telemetry generated by shadow actors, what some might call deep state intelligence factions, designed specifically to terrify the UK civilian leadership into authorizing a broader war? In Nico's view, the deeper you look at the synchronization of these crises, the more it appears that the escalation ladder is being artificially managed to serve a broader geopolitical agenda.
Which brings us right back to the money and the intersection of war and finance. Because Nico points out that the most effective weapon being used in the Middle East right now isn't a drone, and it isn't a missile. It's an insurance policy.
This is perhaps the most insidious, brilliant mechanism of control discussed in the entire broadcast. When we think of a blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, we picture Iranian fast attack boats with machine guns physically blocking massive oil tankers.
Right, kinetic interdiction.
But the president of Iran actually stated publicly that commercial shipping could pass through the strait, provided the vessels weren't flagged to hostile nations planning strikes. Yet, global shipping conglomerates still diverted their fleets, adding weeks to their transit times by sailing all the way around the Horn of Africa. Why? Because of an office building in London.
Lloyd's of London, the insurance underwriters.
Exactly. You cannot move a $200 million supertanker carrying $100 million of crude oil without maritime insurance. If a syndicate at Lloyd's of London decides to declare the Persian Gulf a war risk zone, they can either flat out refuse to underwrite the voyage, or they can raise the premium to such an astronomically high percentage that the voyage becomes instantly unprofitable for the shipping company.
It is a soft blockade. It's a financial choke point.
Nico describes it beautifully as a warm and cold water tap. This tap isn't controlled by generals. It is controlled entirely by financial elites in European capitals. They don't need to fire a single bullet to shut down global shipping. They just refuse to sign a PDF.
Incredible.
And the moment they do, the ships stop, the supply drops, the price of fuel spikes globally, the commodity traders make their billions, the governments collect their windfall taxes, and the geopolitical tension ratchets up another notch.
It is an utterly seamless, invisible system of wealth extraction. The military tension creates the risk justifies the insurance blockade, the blockade creates the scarcity drives the price, and the middle class pays the bill.
It is the industrialization of crisis.
And, when you look at how insurance conglomerates and geopolitical shadow plays can essentially siphon billions from the global economy, it forces you to look at how wealth is extracted on a domestic level.
Yes.
Because if they can throttle the Strait of Hormuz to take your money at the pump, they can certainly rewrite the tax code to reach directly into your bank account. And that brings us to the domestic policy equivalent of a soft blockade, the proposed Box 3 wealth tax in the Netherlands.
Right. We are pivoting from the high seas right into the financial architecture of the state. The Lighthouse broadcast brings on Marcel Mellis, a highly successful entrepreneur and investor, to dissect this specific, incredibly controversial piece of legislation slated to roll out around 2028. To understand the visceral anger of the entrepreneurial class regarding Box 3, we have to meticulously break down the mechanics of a law, because it violates the fundamental historical understanding of how taxation works.
Right. Because historically, taxation is an event-based system. You earn a salary, you get taxed on the income, you buy a car, you pay a sales tax, you invest in a stock, it goes up, you sell it, and you pay a capital gains tax on the profit you just realized.
That is the traditional model. You pay tax on realized liquidity.
Mm.
But the proposed Box 3 system is fundamentally different. It is a 36% tax on unrealized capital gains.
Unrealized gains. Okay, I want to make sure every single listener feels the reality of this concept because when I first read this in the source material, I had to read it 3 times to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding it. It is essentially taxing phantom money.
It is taxing a projection. Let's walk through the exact, highly illustrative example Marcel Mellis provides in the broadcast. Let's say you take a significant risk and invest in an asset. Let's use Bitcoin or a portfolio of tech stocks or a startup. Your initial investment is 1 million euros. You hold the asset, you endure the market volatility, and it turns out to be a phenomenal year. By December 31st, the market value of your asset has doubled.
Okay, so I take out my phone, I open my brokerage app, and the screen says my portfolio is now worth 2 million euros. I feel amazing. I'm a millionaire twice over. On paper.
Emphasize on paper. You have not sold a single share of stock. You have not sold a single Bitcoin. You do not have an extra million euros sitting in your checking account. The money is entirely illiquid, tied up in the asset. Under a traditional system, you owe the government nothing until you decide to cash out. But under the proposed Box 3 mechanics, the Dutch tax authority looks at your app screen on December 31st and says, "Congratulations on your brilliant investment. Your wealth increased by 1 million euros. You now owe us a 36% tax on that growth."
So the government hands me a mandatory, legally binding tax bill for 360,000 euros, due immediately.
Yes.
But I don't have 360,000 euros. All of my capital is invested in the asset. How am I supposed to pay the state?
You have two choices, both of which damage your financial health. You can either take out a massive personal loan to pay the tax, taking on immense interest debt, or you're forced by the state to liquidate a massive portion of your asset to sell your Bitcoin or your stocks just to generate the cash required to pay the tax on the fact that your asset went up in value.
That is confiscatory. It essentially punishes you for making a good investment by forcing you to dismantle the investment. But here is where the math gets truly terrifying. What happens in year 2? Because markets don't just go up. Let's say the tech bubble bursts or Bitcoin crashes. In year 2, my asset plummets back down to its original value of 1 million euros.
This is the fatal flaw in taxing unrealized gains. Your app now says you have 1 million euros. You are exactly where you started 2 years ago. You have made zero actual profit. But the government already extracted 360,000 euros from you in year 1.
So I'm actually down 360,000 euros. I lost massive wealth purely because the government taxed a phantom peak in a volatile market. I paid tax on money that evaporated.
You were penalized for market volatility on capital you never possessed. And Marcel points out the catastrophic macroeconomic consequence of this mechanism. It annihilates the principle of compound interest. Compound returns are the bedrock of modern wealth creation. Your money generates a return, and then that larger pool of money generates an even larger return over decades. It's how pension funds work. It's how generational wealth is built.
But if the government is taking a 36% haircut off the top every single time the line on the graph goes up, the snowball never gets a chance to roll down the hill. It just melts.
It stalls the engine of private investment. Marcel argues it acts as a massive structural deterrent. If you were a brilliant software engineer, why would you take the massive personal risk of founding a startup in the Netherlands? If your company gets a high valuation on paper, say a venture capital firm values your startup at 10 million euros, you suddenly owe the government 3.6 million euros in cash, even though your startup isn't turning a profit yet. It forces founders to sell their companies just to pay the tax man.
Okay, I understand the entrepreneurial anger, but I have to represent the other side of the aisle here impartially.
Sure.
A lot of listeners are probably thinking, oh, my heart bleeds for the guy with 2 million euros in Bitcoin complaining about taxes. Society needs schools, roads, and hospitals. If you have wealth, you should pay for the society that allowed you to build it. Tax the rich.
And that is a powerful moral argument. The Lighthouse broadcast does not shy away from it. They play a clip of a well-known Dutch commentator named Sander Schimmelpenninck, who champions exactly that perspective. He aggressively dismisses the complaints of entrepreneurs like Mellis. Schimmelpenninck argues that the tax is fundamentally about fairness. He believes the wealthy have shielded their capital for too long, and that if billionaires are complaining about the tax code, it is empirical proof that the policy is finally working.
Right. The idea is that this is a weapon to target the ultra-elite. But let's look at the actual mechanics of the law. Does a policy like Box 3 actually capture the wealth of the billionaires?
And this is where Marcel Mellis delivers a crushing reality check. The answer is absolutely not. The billionaires will not pay this tax
Why not? The law is the law.
because the ultra-rich do not hold wealth in their own names, and they possess armies of international tax lawyers. Marcel details the exact loopholes they will use. In the Netherlands, an individual can transfer their assets into a specific corporate entity called a BV, which is roughly equivalent to a limited liability company.
Okay.
By sheltering the capital inside the corporate structure, it becomes insulated from the individual Box 3 wealth tax. Alternatively, they simply engage in geographic arbitrage. Marcel gives a specific example of a wealthy individual buying high-end real estate in Dubai.
So they just move the money to a jurisdiction that doesn't tax unrealized gains.
Exactly. The capital flows like water around the obstacle. The billionaires escape completely unharmed.
So if the billionaires escape, who is actually left holding the bag? Who is the state extracting this money from?
It falls squarely on the shoulders of the middle class, the small-time retail investors, and most devastatingly, private homeowners. Let's look at real estate. In the Netherlands, the government assigns every home an assessed value, known as the WOZ value. Over the last decade, primarily due to artificial scarcity in the housing market and zoning laws, the WOZ values of everyday family homes have skyrocketed.
Okay, so let's say I bought a modest family home 10 years ago for 300,000 euros. Today, because the market is insane, the government assesses my WOZ value at 600,000 euros.
Under the logical trajectory of the Box 3 principles that Marcel warns about, the state views that €300,000 increase in your home's value as an unrealized capital gain. They could legally demand a percentage of that paper profit in taxes.
But I'm still just sleeping in the bedrooms and cooking in the kitchen. I haven't sold the house. I don't have an extra 100,000 euros lying around to pay the government just because they decided my house is worth more.
Which leaves you with the exact same horrific choices as the startup founder. You either take out a second mortgage and drown in debt to pay the tax on your own home, or you are forced to sell your family home and downsize just to satisfy the state's demand for a cut of your phantom wealth.
It transforms the concept of private property into a leasing agreement with the state, where the rent goes up every time the market improves. It's terrifying.
And Marcel points out the macroeconomic endgame of this hostility toward property and investment, capital flight. When a sovereign nation aggressively, punitively targets the wealth creators, the entrepreneurs, and the middle-class investors, the capital simply packs its bags and leaves. It emigrates to jurisdictions that welcome and reward investment.
The money just walks out the door. And what does that leave behind?
Marcel paints a very bleak 5 to 10 year economic forecast for the Netherlands. He describes a vacuum effect. The financial engine, the investors, the startup capital, the high-income earners, exits the borders. But the state's massive financial liabilities remain. The costs of infrastructure, healthcare, and heavily subsidized populations do not decrease. When you chase away the tax base but keep the spending, the entire social democratic model risks structural collapse.
It is a devastating critique. This entire mechanism, taxing phantom money, taxing a projection on a screen, is essentially a massive bait and switch. The government points at your paper wealth and taxes you as if it were actual liquid cash in a vault. And, once you start recognizing that pattern of the bait and switch in finance, you start seeing it in other systems where the stakes are far higher than a tax bill, systems dealing with actual human biology.
And that transition brings us to the final and unequivocally the most shocking segment of the Lighthouse TV broadcast. We are stepping out of the realm of economic theory and into the intensely guarded domain of public health data and institutional accountability.
The broadcast pivots to Germany. Specifically, they focus on March 19th, when the 18th session of the official German Bundestag, their federal parliament, convened a special Corona Inquiry Committee.
It is crucial to set the scene here. This is not a fringe video, and this is not a blog post. This is a formalized, sworn parliamentary inquiry conducted by a G7 nation to forensically examine the rollout of the most widely distributed medical product in human history. To analyze the testimonies given at this inquiry, the broadcast brings on Professor Theo Schetters, a highly credentialed immunologist.
And Professor Schetters focuses on the explosive testimony of one specific witness, a former toxicologist who worked at Pfizer. What this scientist stated on the public record under the scrutiny of Parliament is just jaw-dropping.
The allegations strike at the very heart of the conflict between the speed of the pandemic response and the rigorous safety protocols that are supposed to govern biotechnology. The core of the toxicologist's testimony is a timeline of bypass safety checks.
Let's break down the specific claims. What was the first major red flag raised in the Bundestag?
The toxicologist testified that the carcinogenicity of the mRNA vaccine, meaning its potential to induce or accelerate cancer, was never tested prior to its global regulatory approval. When pressed on why such a fundamental toxicological study was skipped, the justification entered into the record was simply time constraints. The sheer panic and urgency of the pandemic were deemed sufficient to waive long-term oncological screening.
Never tested for causing cancer because they were in a hurry. I mean, if I buy a new brand of weed killer at the hardware store, I expect that the chemical company was legally mandated to test if it causes cancer before putting it on the shelf. To hear that a novel biological product injected into billions of arms bypassed that specific screening is deeply unsettling. But the testimony goes further, right? It touches on reproductive health.
Yes. The source material details the toxicologist's severe critique of the reproductive toxicology studies conducted by the manufacturer. The testimony alleged that the studies performed on rat populations to assess impacts on fertility and fetal development were fundamentally methodologically flawed. Furthermore, the toxicologist attempted to draw a correlative line between these allegedly inadequate reproductive studies and the statistically significant, highly anomalous drops in birth rates that several Western nations observed in the years following the mass vaccination campaigns.
Okay, those are incredibly heavy, controversial claims regarding cancer and fertility. But the absolute crux of this testimony, the specific mechanism that Professor Shetters zeroes in on, is what they describe as a biological bait and switch. And I need you to explain this process to me meticulously, because if this mechanism is true, it represents a catastrophic failure of global regulatory oversight.
This is the most complex and yet the most vital scientific concept in the entire broadcast. According to the toxicologist's sworn testimony, the manufacturer did not use a single unified manufacturing method for the vaccine. They utilized two entirely different distinct production processes.
Process 1 and Process 2. Let's isolate them. What was Process 1?
Let's define Process 1. Process 1 was the method used to create the relatively small, specific batches of the vaccine that were administered to the tens of thousands of participants in the official clinical trials. These are the trials that generated the crucial safety and efficacy data. This data was then bound into a massive dossier and handed to the FDA, the EMA, and regulators worldwide to secure emergency use authorization.
Okay, so Process 1 is the product that actually earned the gold star of approval. How was it made?
According to the testimony, Process 1 utilized a highly sophisticated computer-controlled synthetic method. It was essentially an automated clean room process to build the mRNA sequence. Because it was synthetic and highly regulated by computer protocols, the resulting biological product was incredibly pristine. It was a pure, clean formulation.
Great. So they test the pure synthetic version, the regulators scrutinize the data, they see minimal adverse effects, and they approve it. The system worked.
But here is the catastrophic pivot highlighted in the inquiry. The source material, referencing the work of prominent critics like Dr. Sucharit Bhakti, explains a brutal logistical reality. This computer-controlled synthetic Process 1 was incredibly expensive, and more importantly, it was far too slow. You cannot use Process 1 to manufacture billions of doses in a matter of months to supply a global rollout. The math doesn't work.
So they needed a faster, cheaper factory. They needed Process 2. What is Process 2?
To achieve the massive, unprecedented industrial scale required, the toxicologist testified that the manufacturer abandoned the clean synthetic method and switched to biological fermentation. They utilized bacteria. Specifically, they used Escherichia coli, commonly known as E. coli.
Wait, they used E. coli bacteria to make a viral vaccine? How does that even work?
They essentially turned massive vats of living bacteria into microscopic biological factories. You take a plasmid, which is a small circular piece of DNA containing the genetic instructions for the spike protein, and you insert it into the E. coli. The living bacteria eat the nutrients in the vat, they rapidly reproduce, and as they multiply, they create millions and millions of copies of that DNA plasmid inside their cell walls.
Okay, I follow the biology. It's an incredibly efficient way to multiply genetic material. But bacteria are living organisms. They are messy. They produce waste.
And that is the exact mechanism of the alleged disaster. Once the E. coli have multiplied the plasmids, you have to extract them. You have to chemically break open the bacterial cell walls, kill the bacteria, and fish out the specific genetic sequence you need, while filtering out all the bacterial waste, the cell membranes, and the bacteria's own DNA.
But we filter things in science all the time. Why is this a problem?
Because, on a molecular level, distinguishing between the intended therapeutic genetic material and the microscopic debris of shattered bacterial DNA at an industrial scale is incredibly difficult. When you rush this purification process to meet global demand, the toxicologist testified, pieces of that bacterial DNA get left behind in the vat.
Contamination.
Massive biological contamination. Process 2 was no longer the pure synthetic substance tested in Process 1. It was a mass-produced product heavily contaminated with bacterial DNA plasmids. And the toxicologist explicitly warned the Bundestag that injecting these specific bacterial DNA impurities packaged inside lipid nanoparticles that carry them directly into human cells could potentially elevate the risk of oncogenesis, the creation of cancer.
This is where Professor Shetters introduced an analogy in the broadcast that just crystallized the entire deception for me. He called it the pot of peanut butter analogy.
It perfectly illustrates the concept of regulatory fraud.
Think about it like this. Imagine a food company wants to sell a revolutionary new brand of peanut butter. They go into a pristine laboratory and they painstakingly craft a tiny artisanal batch. They use the absolute highest grade, organically grown peanuts. They use pure, cold-pressed oil. They take this one perfect, pristine jar to the federal health inspectors. The inspectors put it under the microscope, run all the tests, and say, "Wow, this is incredibly safe, zero toxins, perfectly nutritious. We grant you a global license to sell this product."
The clinical trial phase is complete.
But then the company goes to their massive industrial factory to produce 1 billion jars for the supermarket shelves. And the executives realize that sourcing premium organic peanuts is too expensive and takes too long. So in the dark, they completely switch the recipe. For the mass production, they use cheap, moldy peanuts. They throw in artificial fillers. They use rancid, low-grade oil. It is a completely different, contaminated, inferior product. But, and this is the absolute crux of this deception, they slap the exact same gold seal of approval on the mass-produced jar, pretending it's the artisanal batch they tested in the lab.
That is the exact horrific allegation being leveled at the vaccine manufacturing process. The global public, the media, and the politicians were told they were mandating and receiving the rigorously tested, pristine substance from Process 1. But according to the sworn testimony at this inquiry, billions of people actually received a biologically distinct, mass-produced, bacterially contaminated product from Process 2, a product that had functionally bypassed the stringent safety trials.
It is the ultimate bait and switch. And the most terrifying question is, what is the human cost of that switch? What happens when you put a contaminated Process 2 product into the arms of an entire population?
The broadcast dives into the raw, statistical data presented to the Bundestag to try and quantify that fallout. They reference data from the Paul-Ehrlich Institute, which is the official German federal institute responsible for vaccines and biomedicines. According to the toxicologist's presentation, the institute received 2,133 official reports of deaths occurring in close temporal proximity to the vaccination.
Over 2,000 reported fatalities. That alone is a massive safety signal.
It is, but the toxicologist argued that it is only the tip of the iceberg, due to the inherent flaws of passive reporting systems. In a passive system, a doctor or a grieving family member has to independently make the connection, navigate a bureaucratic maze, and actively fill out a lengthy form to report the adverse event.
Right. And in the middle of a pandemic, doctors are exhausted, ERs are overflowing, and there was massive social pressure not to question the safety of the rollout. Nobody has time or the professional courage to fill out the paperwork.
Because of this immense friction, the toxicologist cited a widely recognized epidemiological metric, an estimated underreporting factor used in the United States. This metric suggests that for every single severe adverse event or death actually documented in a passive system, there are likely 30 cases that go completely unreported.
A 30x multiplier.
Yes. And when you apply that factor of 30 to the 2,133 reported deaths in Germany, the toxicologist suggested to the parliament that the true number of vaccine-related fatalities in Germany alone could realistically be hovering around 60,000.
60,000 deaths. That is not a statistical anomaly. That is not a rare side effect. That is the population of a small city. That is a catastrophic, generational, institutional failure.
It is a staggering mortality figure that, if accurate, demands criminal investigations and a total root and branch reevaluation of the entire global public health apparatus. And what makes this so damning is that the rushed, chaotic nature of this rollout was essentially admitted by the corporate executives themselves. Professor Shetters points to a highly revealing moment in the European Parliament involving a senior Pfizer executive, Janine Small.
I remember this. She was being grilled by MEPs about the speed of the trials. What did she actually say on the record?
When relentlessly pressed about the lack of specific testing prior to the rollout, specifically whether the product stopped transmission, she defended the corporation's actions by stating they had to move at the speed of science. But the quote that Professor Sketters heavily focuses on is her admission regarding the manufacturing process. She stated that they were essentially building the machine while flying it.
Building the machine while flying it, that is an absolutely terrifying analogy when you are talking about injecting a novel, genetically active biological product into the bodies of billions of healthy people, including children. You don't build an airplane while you have a billion passengers already strapped into the seats.
It is a stunning admission that standard operating procedures, long-term safety protocols, and rigorous quality control were entirely suspended under the impenetrable shield of a declared emergency.
Which brings us to a really critical meta question about how our society functions. If a credible toxicologist stands up in a G7 parliament and testifies under oath that the regulatory process was a bait and switch, that bacterial DNA contaminated the vials, and that 60,000 citizens might be dead, why isn't this the lead story on every single news broadcast in the world? Why isn't the map being updated?
Because updating the map requires the cartographers to admit they lied. The Lighthouse broadcast explicitly addresses the media's reaction to this data, and it is a fascinating study in institutional psychology. Professor Sketters discusses his profound frustration with the mainstream journalistic apparatus in the Netherlands. The broadcast specifically names Martin Ceulemans, a prominent science journalist for the Volkskrant.
Okay, so how did Ceulemans and the mainstream press react to the video of the Bundestag inquiry? Did they launch an investigative team into the E. coli plasmid replication process? Did they demand answers about process 1 versus process 2?
According to Professor Sketters, they did exactly the opposite. Their reaction was a total refusal to engage with the biological data. They completely ignored the mechanism of bacterial contamination. Instead, the tactic was a coordinated, aggressive character assassination of the messengers. Ceulemans allegedly wrote off the highly credentialed experts raising these alarms as old, frustrated, rancorous men who have fallen down rabbit holes.
It's purely an ad hominem attack.
Completely. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it reveals the ultimate defense mechanism of the establishment. When the official narrative, the map, is challenged by dense, complex, terrifying, mathematically sound data, the institution's first and only line of defense is to delegitimize the person holding the data. You don't argue about the molecular weight of the bacterial DNA. You just publicly label the immunologist a conspiracy theorist.
It instantly shuts down the conversation. Sketters pointed out in the broadcast that they actually invited these journalists, including Ceulemans, to a specialized medical conference to debate the data openly, peer-to-peer. And the journalists simply refused to show up. They literally refused to look at the territory.
Because acknowledging the territory means admitting catastrophic liability. If the media admits they championed a contaminated product, if the politicians admit they mandated a bait and switch, the institutional liability is existential. It is easier to attack the scientists than to admit the system failed.
Okay. Let's pull all of this together, because we have covered an immense, complex landscape today, navigating through the 4 completely distinct pillars presented in this Lighthouse TV broadcast. And the synthesis of all this information is incredibly powerful.
We began by looking at the physical logistics of the global economy. We saw a skipper sitting in a European harbor staring at full storage tanks and idle ships, while the official narrative schemes scarcity to justify crippling price hikes at the pump, mathematically orchestrating a transport infarct that enriches commodity traders and state tax coffers at the expense of the working class.
Then we scaled up to the global stage. We saw how geopolitical tension around Kharg Island managing 90% of Iran's oil is manipulated not just by massive armies, but by the threat of drone warfare against 20-minuters, anomalous missile strikes on Diego Garcia, and the invisible, bloodless chokehold of London insurance underwriters acting as the warm and cold water tap of global trade.
We brought it back to domestic policy by examining the proposed Box 3 wealth tax. We dismantled a policy pitched as moral fairness, revealing it as a punitive wealth extraction tool that taxes phantom, unrealized gains, traps middle-class homeowners, and threatens to trigger a massive wave of capital flight that could hollow out a sovereign economy, while billionaires utilized corporate loopholes to escape untouched.
And finally, we plunged into the microscopic molecular world of biological data. We examined an official parliamentary inquiry exposing a catastrophic bait and switch where the pristine synthetic vaccine tested in clinical trials was allegedly replaced by a bacterially contaminated, mass-produced version for the public, with tens of thousands of potential casualties swept under the rug by a media apparatus entirely focused on protecting the narrative rather than investigating the science.
The connecting thread across all four of these disparate realities is undeniable. It is the absolute stark gap between the official narratives we are constantly spoon-fed and their ruthless operational reality functioning behind the curtain. It is the realization that the rules are entirely malleable, that crises can be manufactured or leveraged, and that the ultimate goal of these systems consistently appears to be the extraction of wealth, the consolidation of power, or the enforcement of compliance from the general public.
So, why does all of this matter to you? Why should you care about the molecular weight of a DNA plasmid or the demurrage fees of a ship in Ghent? Because navigating the modern world requires looking past the surface. You cannot afford to just passively accept the map you are handed.
You cannot rely solely on the label on the jar. You have to ask how the peanut butter was actually made. You have to ask who possesses the financial incentive to hold 15 ships in the harbor while you pay double for groceries. You have to ask who truly benefits when the rules of taxation are rewritten to punish your unrealized success.
It is about reclaiming your own intellectual agency in an age of mass coordinated information. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought, something to seriously mull over as you watch the news tomorrow morning.
If the most powerful institutions across the global energy sector, the financial sector, and the public health apparatus have established a verifiable, repeated pattern of altering the rules, hiding the raw data, and manufacturing scarcity under the constant, unassailable justification of an emergency.
What happens when the next global crisis arrives? Will the public ever blindly trust an institutional narrative again? Or are we entering a new era? An era where every single citizen has no choice but to become their own investigative analyst, constantly ruthlessly checking the map against the territory.
It is a daunting, exhausting prospect, but given the evidence, it is perhaps a necessary evolution for survival.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Our mission is always to keep you well informed, to keep you sharp, and to help you see the mechanics of the world a little more clearly. Because the next time they tell you there's a fuel shortage, or a fair new tax, or a flawless medical solution, remember Hank Boonstra sitting idle next to the full tanks. Remember that the map is rarely the territory. Stay curious.